Hi guys, so today we are going to talk about chapter 13, which is the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. We're going to go through the regular spinal cord anatomy, and then we're going to talk about the physiology, so how it actually works, and then we're going to talk about the actual spinal nerves themselves. So the spinal cord itself is protected in a few ways. First of all, it's housed within the vertebrae themselves. So the vertebral column actually surrounds the spinal cord. So as you can see where the arrow shows that big hole, that is the vertebral foramina. And the spinal cord basically runs right through that. So you can see there's quite a bit of protection for the spinal cord. In addition to that, there are some meninges that cover it, which we'll talk about in a second. There's also cerebral spinal fluid circulating around, which we will talk about. There's vertebral ligaments holding them in place. And there's also adipose tissue and muscles surrounding it. So this picture is showing the meninges, which, like I said, we'll talk about in a little bit, and then where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates and where the fat is located. And this picture shows you the ligaments that stabilize it and hold it in place as well. So we have three meninges covering the spinal cord, and they also cover the brain. But for the spinal cord, the outermost layer is the dura mater. It's the same in the brain, but we'll talk about it specifically when we get to the brain. But the dura mater is really tough. It is dense, irregular connective tissue. And if you actually dissect a brain, you can feel how tough it is and unbreakable. It doesn't just pull apart very easily because, again, it's dense, irregular connective tissue. And remember, dense, irregular connective tissue, the fibers run in all sorts of directions, which make it stable and very tough, resisting pulls in multiple directions. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater. It is a web-like network of collagen fibers. There are some elastic fibers there, but it's mainly collagen. Now, when you think of collagen, you should think of strength, so it makes it very strong. However, it's avascular. It does not have any blood vessel innervation. And then the innermost layer actually sticks right to the spinal cord. It's called the pia mater. It's very thin, it's transparent. It covers the entire surface of the spinal cord and also the brain, but like I said, we'll talk about that when we get there. And it's similar to the arachnoid mater, except it is highly vascular. So there are blood vessels running to keep this one nourished and to help nourish the spinal cord, of course. And in the picture, you can see the pia mater on the inside, the arachnoid mater in the middle, and then the outer dura mater. Now, if you have something called meningitis, that's an inflammation of the meninges. So this needs to be treated right away because it can be very deadly. It also can be bacterial or viral. And depending on which type you have, of course, that's going to differ the treatment. They usually have to diagnose this using a spinal tap. So the spaces are the epidural space, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. The epidural space is between the dura mater and the inside wall of the vertebral canal. This is where adipose tissue is. This is also where you get what's called an epidural shot. The subdural space is between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and this actually contains interstitial fluid. And then the subarachnoid space, which is between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And then the subarachnoid space, which is between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, actually contains cerebral spinal fluid. So that's where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates around to add an added layer of protection to the spinal cord. It will protect it against any shocks that occur. So there's the epidural space, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. The denticulate ligaments are triangular shaped extensions of the pia mater, but they're a little bit thicker, and they hold the spinal cord in place and also protect it against shock. So you can see in this picture where they're at and how they kind of spread out a little bit and grab the spinal cord to help stabilize it. So here's an overview. You have the word list over there, the arachnoid mater, dura mater, pia mater, the denticulate ligament, the spinal nerve, which is a mixed nerve, the subarachnoid space, and the subdural space, to try to figure out real quick where those go. So A is the spinal nerve. B is the denticulate ligament. C is the subarachnoid space. D is the subdural space. E is the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. F is the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer. G is the dura mater, which is the outer toughest layer. So the external anatomy, the spinal cord actually is a continuation of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. So the brainstem comes out the back and bottom of the skull, and then it turns into the spinal cord, basically. It's continuous. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which exit laterally and go to the body tissues. They end at about L2 in an adult and about L3 to L4 in a newborn, because as you know, the spinal cord grows a little bit as we age. It stops growing, however, about 4 to 5 years. The vertebral column, however, keeps getting longer. So the spinal cord does not actually run the entire length of the vertebral column. The cervical and lumbar enlargements serve as points of origin for the nerves to go to the arms and the legs. So as you can see over at the picture, the cervical enlargement is right here. The lumbar enlargement is right here. Now keep in mind the lumbar enlargement actually starts up here around T11 or 12 and then runs down to L2. This is showing you an actual spinal cord. So this area right here is called the Cauda equina. These are the roots of the inferior spinal nerves, and they exit the spinal cord at L1, but they stay inside the canal and continue on down. However, they have very specific control over our bladder. If you have a back injury and you lose control over your bladder, they will immediately bring you in because it's an emergency situation, because you probably have a problem at the Cauda equina. And then at the bottom here, the filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater, and that's what anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. A spinal tap is a lumbar puncture. This is where they actually tap into the space where the cerebral spinal fluid is located between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and they remove some of it to diagnose meningitis or other things. It can also be used to introduce antibiotics directly into your system, anesthetics, chemo, or contrast media. Internally speaking, the spinal cord is partially divided into the right and left sides. It's partial because the sulcus and the fissure do not meet in the middle. The anterior median fissure is a very deep, wide groove on the front or ventral side of the spinal cord. The posterior median sulcus is a shallow, narrow groove on the back of the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Gray matter versus white matter. It's an important distinction. Gray matter is shaped like an H or a butterfly, and it's surrounded by white matter. Here you can see the gray matter, and then it's surrounded completely by white matter. The gray matter contains cell bodies, neuroglia, and unmyelinated axons and dendrites. The nucleus is a mass of cell bodies and dendrites inside the central nervous system. So here's the nucleus. The central canal is a small space right in the center of the gray matter, also called the gray commissure. It runs down the entire length of the spinal cord and contains cerebral spinal fluid. At the top of the spinal cord, it actually becomes the fourth ventricle here inside the medulla oblongata. So here's the central canal running up the spinal cord, and then when it gets to the medulla, it forms the fourth ventricle. Gray matter is divided into horns. There's a posterior or dorsal gray horn, and then there's an anterior or ventral gray horn. The posterior or dorsal gray horns are closer to the back of the spinal cord, hence the name. They contain the cell bodies of interneurons and the terminal axons of sensory neurons. So the posterior gray horns are sensory in function, and that's very important to remember. This is showing you the reflex arc. So here's the receptor, the sensory receptor, sending the impulse down a sensory neuron. It's going to go into the cell body of the sensory neuron, into the central nervous system through an association neuron or an interneuron. Then it's going to go out the motor neuron to the effector gland. The anterior or ventral gray horns are at the front or ventral side of the spinal cord. These contain the nuclei of somatic motor neurons, which go to the skeletal muscles. So the ventral or anterior gray horn are motor in function. So that's a very important distinction. The dorsal gray horns are sensory. The anterior gray horns are motor. The lateral gray horns are between the anterior and posterior horns, so they're right here. They're found only in the thoracic and lumbar areas, and they have cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So the lateral gray horns are autonomic in function. White matter is located around the periphery of the spinal cord. In the brain, it's the opposite. In the brain, white matter is on the inside, gray matter is on the outside. But in the spinal cord, gray matter is on the inside, white matter is on the outside. Now, white matter has myelinated motor and sensory axons. And this is very important. Remember, myelinated neurons, the impulses travel faster. So in the spinal cord, it makes sense for the white matter to be on the outside because that's where the spinal nerves are coming in and out. So the white matter is going to be easily accessed by the spinal nerves. And that's important because that's where transmissions and impulses are faster. It's divided into columns, not horns. So the white matter has the anterior or ventral columns, the posterior or dorsal columns, lateral white columns. So the anterior or ventral, you have right and left, and it's between the anterior gray horns. Posterior, you have right and left, and it's between the posterior gray horns. Lateral are on the right and left sides between the anterior and posterior horns. Each column contains bundles of nerves called tracts, which are fasciculi. The white matter tracts carry sensory information up and motor information down between the brain and the body. So sensory is incoming and going up, motor is outgoing and going down. The gray matter is what receives and integrates all of these messages. So mixed nerves have both sensory and motor functions. So here's your reflex arc again. So the sensory receptors in the skin are going to pick up the signal. It's going to go through the sensory neuron, through the posterior horn. Interneuron is going to get all the information together and integrate it. The decision then, the outgoing message is going to go out the anterior gray horn, through the motor neuron to the effector organs. So sensory receptors pick up the information, take it through the sensory neuron, through the posterior horn. Interneuron's going to integrate the information out the anterior horn, through the motor neuron to the effector organs. Functions of the spinal cord include connecting the nervous system with the rest of the body and also providing a control center for reflexes, which we're going to talk about reflexes in a second. We have ascending or sensory tracts, which carry information towards the brain. Now, ascending means up. So sensory information is going up towards the brain. It's going to carry impulses for pain, temperature, touch, deep pressure, vibrations, and proprioception. Now, proprioception is very important. It's awareness of where we're at in space. It's awareness of our posture. It's important for the brain to know if we're standing up or laying down, sitting down, where we're at in space, if we're walking. All of this is important information for the brain to have because the brain has to know, well, we're standing up, so our blood pressure is going to be a little bit different. Or we're laying down, our heart rate should be different. Things like that. So there's the posterior column tract and the muscle spindles for proprioception. Now the descending means going down. So descending are motor tracts that carry the information from the brain down to the spinal cord, down the skeletal muscle. We have two main tracts, the direct and the indirect. The direct or pyramidal tracts originate in the cerebral cortex. So these are conscious things. They carry voluntary impulses to the skeletal muscles. So this is how we coordinate movements that are precise and voluntary, but this is how we can do it. The indirect or extrapyramidal tracts, on the other hand, originate in the brainstem. So these are unconscious things. They carry nerve impulses for autonomic movements. Involuntary motor control movements like posture, balance, orientation, those are all going to be taken on the indirect extrapyramidal tracts. Then we have reflexes. Reflexes are predictable automatic responses to changes in the environment. Their point is to help maintain homeostasis. They're automatic. You don't have to think about them. They're predictable. But what it does is it allows our body to maintain homeostasis because we can make very rapid adjustments to any imbalance that occurs. So for example, if you grab a hot pan, you don't sit there and think, wow, that pan's hot, I should drop it. You just drop it. It's a reflex. Our sensory receptors picked up that homeostatic imbalance, as in our fingers were very hot and potentially getting burned, which made a rapid reflex to drop the pan. We have two types of reflexes, spinal and cranial. Spinal reflexes integration occurs in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The patellar reflex, the Achilles, crossed extensor, and flexor withdrawal reflexes are all spinal. Then we have cranial reflexes where integration occurs in the gray matter of the brainstem. The gag reflex, the pupillary light reflex, and the blink reflex are examples of those. Then we have somatic and autonomic reflexes. Somatic reflexes involve contraction of the skeletal muscle, which is voluntary. Some of the somatic reflexes are spinal, some of them are cranial. Autonomic reflexes are our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. They involve smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, and these are involuntary. Remember, autonomic, automatic. Now, some of these are going to be spinal and some are going to be cranial. The reflex arc has 5 components. There's one synapse. This is the simplest type. You have a receptor. It's going to respond to some stimulus, which is right here. It's going to cause an impulse to be transmitted down the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is going to carry that impulse to the integrating center, which is inside the central nervous system. It's an inner neuron. And then the motor neuron is going to carry the response from the integrating center out to the effector organ. And then once it gets to the effector organ, the response is going to occur. Now over here, there's a crash course that I want you guys to watch. Remember to be in slideshow mode and you can watch it. Somatic spinal reflexes include the stretch reflex, the tendon reflex, the flexor withdrawal reflex, and the crossed extensor reflex. So the stretch reflex, as I said, prevents overstretching. The stretch receptors like muscle spindles, tendon organs, proprioceptors. It is monosynaptic, meaning it contains one sensory neuron and one motor neuron. So there's 2 neurons, 1 synapse, like here. Or they can be polysynaptic, meaning they have 3 neurons and 2 synapses. Now, a polysynaptic arc is going to be to an antagonistic muscle. So usually you're going to have a sensory neuron, an association neuron, and a motor neuron, and then 2 synapses because you have the sensory neuron, you have a synapse between that and the association neuron, and then you're going to have a synapse between the association neuron and the motor neuron. Hence 3 neurons, 2 synapses. So mono means 1, so 1 synapse. Poly means multiple, so more than 1 synapse. The ipsilateral reflex means that sensory input enters the spinal cord on the same side as the motor impulse is going to leave the spinal cord. All monosynaptic reflex arcs are ipsilateral. So it comes in on the same side that it goes out. Reciprocal innervation is when the neural circuit that causes simultaneous contraction of one muscle group and relaxation of antagonistic muscles. What this is going to do is going to prevent opposing muscles conflicting. So they're not going to be fighting to try to respond, basically. And it's going to prevent overstretching of muscles. Now, this is very important in coordinating body movements because you do not want a muscle group and its antagonist both contracting at the same time. You want the muscle group contracting and its antagonist relaxing, or vice versa. So here's a monosynaptic and here's a polysynaptic. The monosynaptic is a straight line, polysynaptic is a dotted line. The purpose of the tendon reflex is to prevent damage to the tendons caused by too much tension being put on them. So it's going to control the muscle tension by causing the muscles to relax. It's ipsilateral, meaning it comes in on the same side it goes out, and it's polysynaptic, so there's more than one synapse here. Reciprocal innervation is also present, so the antagonist muscle is going to relax. The flexor withdrawal reflex, the point is to protect and to move a limb to avoid pain. It's ipsilateral, meaning comes in the same side it goes out, polysynaptic, so more than one synapse, and reciprocal innervation. The motor neurons are going to cause the flexor muscles in the thigh to contract and move the limb, and also cause the extensor muscles of the same leg to relax. So basically what's going to happen is if you step on something, that thigh is going to contract, moving your limb, pulling your muscle up, and you're going to switch to the other leg to prevent damage to that leg. But at the same time, the extensor muscles are going to relax because you don't want your leg trying to flex and extend at the same time. Then we have the crossed extensor reflex. It's again protective, but the purpose is to maintain balance during the flexor reflex we just talked about. It's polysynaptic and contralateral, meaning that the sensory impulses enter one side and the motor impulses leave on the opposite side. So this is the portion of the flexor reflex where your other foot steps down. So reciprocal innervation is involved. So you have the flexor reflex where you step on something and your flexors in your thigh contract, your extensors relax, and you lift your foot up. But while you're lifting your foot up, you have to be able to put the other leg down for balance or you're going to fall. So you lift your leg up with the flexor reflex, and then this crossed extensor reflex causes the opposite leg to go down so that you're not falling on your butt, basically. We also use reflexes to diagnose and assess nervous system problems. If a reflex is either absent or abnormal, damage can be located somewhere along that pathway. So the patellar reflex, the knee jerk reflex, it's a stretch reflex where you tap the patellar ligament and then the quadriceps femoris contracts and your knee extends. If that doesn't happen, something may be wrong along that conduction pathway. The Achilles reflex or ankle jerk, same type of thing, except you tap the calcaneal tendon and your gastrocnemius and soleus muscles contract, and it causes plantar flexion of the foot. Again, if that doesn't happen, something can be wrong along that conduction pathway. The Babinski reflex is a special reflex. This is when you stroke the lateral outer margins on the sole of the foot. It causes extension or straightening out of the great toe, and the toes fan out. Now, this is normal in children less than a year and a half old because the extension of the toes represents an incomplete myelination of the corticospinal tract. However, a positive Babinski sign after 1.5 is abnormal, which means there's an interruption in the corticospinal tract. So normally, if a child or a person, an adult, let's say, over 1.5 years old, when the bottom of their foot is stroked, plantar flexion and curling of the toes occurs. So if somebody strokes the bottom of your foot, your toes are going to curl up and plantar flexion is going to happen. However, again, children fanning the toes out, it's completely normal. Adults, however, it is an abnormal sign that there's some sort of interruption in the corticospinal tract. Cranial reflexes, the gag reflex, the blink reflex. Okay, spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. They're identified according to their region and the level of the spinal cord where they exit, except for C1, of course. There's 5 regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. The cervical, there are 8 pairs of nerves, C1 to C8. The first pair leave above C1, and the last pair are below C7. The thoracic, there's 12 pairs, T1 to T12. The lumbar, there's 5, L1 to L5. The spinal cord actually ends between vertebrae L1 to L2 at the conus medullaris. These lower spinal nerves, however, stay inside the canal, and then some exit lower down at the Cauda equina, which we talked about already. Then the sacral, there's 5 pairs, S1 to S5, and the coccygeal has 1 pair. Each spinal nerve has 2 separate points of attachment to the spinal cord: the dorsal or posterior root, which contains sensory axons, and a ganglion, which, remember, a ganglion are sensory cell bodies. And then the ventral or anterior root, which contain motor axons, which are the cell bodies of motor neurons located in the gray matter, also called the anterior horns. These roots are going to unite at the intervertebral foramina, which is a spinal nerve. The spinal nerves are mixed. They have both sensory and motor fibers. And if you have pressure on a nerve, it causes it to tingle, and like we say when our foot goes to sleep. So spinal nerves are mixed nerves. You have sensory information coming in, you have motor information going out. The dorsal root, sensory; ventral or anterior root, motor. We have the 3 coverings that should sound familiar: epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. The epineurium covers the entire nerve. It's fused with the dura mater. The perineurium surrounds a fascicle or bundle of individual axons, and the endoneurium surrounds each individual axon. We have plexuses, which are networks of adjacent nerves. There are 4 major ones in the body: the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. Spinal nerves T2 to T12 do not form plexuses, so you might be noticing that the thoracic ones are left out. Well, they are. There's no plexuses involved. The intercostal or thoracic nerves, you have innervation of the skin and muscles in the intercostal spaces and the abdomen. So these plexuses, so the cervical and brachial plexuses are over here in green. The thoracic innervation is what you see over here in blue. The lumbar plexus is in red, and then the sacral plexus is in purple. So those are the areas that are going to be affected by those plexuses. Dermatomes are skin segments innervated by one spinal nerve. All of the spinal nerves except for C1 innervate specific segments of the skin. Dermatomes actually help doctors determine which segment of the spinal cord or which spinal nerve is damaged. So if you look over here, you've got the plexus, the major nerve that's involved, and then the areas of innervation. So if you have problems in one particular dermatome, the doctor can then help locate which spinal nerve or part of the spinal cord is actually involved and could potentially be damaged. And then this just shows you the broader picture. You've got the innervation, possible symptoms that could be associated with pain in those areas, how the spinal nerves are formed basically, where the spinal cord ends, the different parts of the spinal cord, and then each particular plexus. So hopefully this will help keep you organized for studying. If you have any questions at all, please send me a message and I will answer to the best of my ability. But hopefully this helped you understand the spinal nerves a little bit more. We will talk more later. Bye.